Hello, and welcome to this Adam Smith Institute seminar, webinar, I should say. I'm Eamon Butler, and I'm director of the Adam Smith Institute, which is a free market think tank based here in London. And I'm assisted in this by video cast by Matthew Lesh, who's our director of research, and he's going to be fielding the questions and pushing the buttons, making sure everything works. Our topic today is reopening lessons from across Europe. Like other countries, the United Kingdom locked down to prevent healthcare being overwhelmed, but lockdowns cause extreme personal and social and economic damage, we're now discovering. So the question is, can we end the lockdown and yet still stay safe? And to discuss that, we have three policy experts from different European countries. From Sweden, which of course maintains social distancing, but uniquely has not locked down its economy. We have Professor Nils Carlson, who's the founding president and chief executive of the Ratio Institute in Stockholm. He's a former president of the City University of Stockholm. From Denmark, which had a harsh lockdown, but which reopened schools and small businesses several weeks ago, including hairdressers. We have Otto Brons Petersen, who's head of analysis at the Center for Political and Economic Studies in Copenhagen, former director of Denmark's Ministry of Taxation and head of the Ministry of Finance. And from Italy, which is one of the, and indeed one of the worst hit regions in Italy, we have Alberto Ming, who's Director General and co-founder of Instituto Bruno Leoni in Milan. And he's written books on liberal thinkers, and his articles appear in newspapers and journals all over the world. If we're just going to each speak for about 5 minutes, and if I could just introduce the United Kingdom's experience. Initially, we had, when the virus was about, we had advice for social distancing and hygiene. And then we had a spell of fine weather and people came out in large numbers. And then Imperial College produced a model saying that hundreds of thousands of people could be killed if we weren't to lock down. So the government did a U-turn from its herd immunity to locking down, trying to suppress the virus. And we've had 6 weeks of that. So bars, restaurants, cafes, all locked down right at the beginning. Businesses can theoretically stay open, but with town centers pretty dead and social distancing measures, which make it difficult for small shops and so on in particular, many have closed. People are allowed to leave the house really for shopping and limited exercise. There's now some slight easing of that, more travel freedom. Returning to work is being encouraged. Nothing has really changed, but it's being encouraged more than it was. And schools are supposed to reopen, although teachers and teachers' unions are questioning as to how this is feasible. But there's still going to be social distancing, and we are going to have quarantines on people coming into the country. There are different rules in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which is going to cause a lot of interesting cross-border problems. I was reading of a golf club today, which is partly in England and partly in Wales. And in Wales, you can't play golf, and in England, you can. So I'm afraid the English golfers will have to play 3 holes 6 times and won't actually be able to go into the rest of the course. So there are absurdities like this. But generally speaking, our prospect here is for more weeks of restrictions. None of us is sure when we're going to get back into our offices, although that's very different in Sweden, where Nils Carlson is actually in his office, because Sweden is largely open and has remained open. It still has rules against gatherings of people of more than 50 people. still have social distancing rules, as I understand it, and definitely urging people to stay home if they're sick. But they've gone for completely different strategies. So, Nils, why don't you tell us about that?
I think it's a good reason for all of us to be humble and cautious. I mean, this is a new experience for everyone, and I think Sweden has, through luck and through institutional social reasons, chosen a fairly, well, defendable strategy so far. We made mistakes, but the general strategy, I think, is a successful strategy that should attract interest for other countries. There are good reasons to open up everywhere. You know, it all started in communist China, January 23rd, when they closed down the Wuhan province. And then I think by a very, well, unreflected reaction, many other countries started to use quite authoritarian measures, closing down schools, closing down offices, closing down businesses, putting police in the street, keeping people in their home, closing borders, restricting internal mobility, and so on and so forth. But Sweden did not. We've had all the time, I've been working all the time at my office. 75% of my scholars here, my researchers, work from home using Zoom and so on, but restaurants are still open. Most businesses are open. Children up to high school still go to school. These strategies were partly, I mean, we have restrictions on public meetings, maximum 50 people are allowed to meet. Bar services are not allowed, but restaurants are open, so you will be served at the table. Outdoor restaurants are open, of course, but tables are positioned a bit from each other, further from each other than before. And one of the reasons we did this was to enable the hospital system to stay open for people who had children to keep on working. And in fact, it's been successful. So we managed to flatten the curve, and the use of intensive care is falling. So it seems to be a good strategy. We didn't really have expert teams or politicians in the television every night. Instead, we had experts from the Swedish Health Authority, scientists, and that they more or less were responsible for a strategy. And officially, it's not about herd immunity, but I think the consequence will be herd immunity. The projections in Stockholm are still a bit unclear, but some of those experts say by end of May, we will reach herd immunity. Some others say mid-June or something. And then, of course, the pandemic will start to decrease by itself. So while letting younger people, healthy people, in effect, be exposed to the virus, it will end faster, I think, than in many other countries. We've had severe problems with elderly in care homes and so on. So we have had high death rates there, but so had Belgium, so had the UK, for example. So the challenge, I think, for other countries is how to open this up in a way and avoid those really hard problems that we have had for sensitive groups, elderly, people who already had diseases, multiple illnesses, and so on. That's the challenge, to open up while protecting the people we really need to protect. That's the challenge. And I think there are lessons to be learned from Sweden. I think there may be no other good way to handle this. The vaccine may take a very long time, and the vaccine may not be that effective either, in fact. So that's what I would like to start to say, at least. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Well, can I just ask you one quick question? I mean, you've written an article, I think I saw it today, saying that basically Sweden's model will be followed by the rest of the world. Are you really confident about that? Are you really confident that the rest of the world will come to its senses and say, well, what we're doing was very costly, hasn't worked, and what Sweden did seems to work fine, so let's take the brakes off?
This is an article that was published in Foreign Affairs today, just a few hours ago, actually. And my argument, or our argument, is that the economic, social, psychological costs of the lockdown, political costs, as we see in Hungary and many other places, are so enormous. With unemployment rates of, well, unheard of since the 1930s. You can't really keep on keeping our economies locked down in the way we have. So we have to start opening up, and we have to do this in a sensitive way. So I think people in other countries or countries will follow Sweden. And that this is actually what we see, that the UK is starting to try to open up. Denmark, Finland has opened schools for younger children. Germany is starting to open up. Even France and Italy and Spain, who are the most hit, of course, are trying, but it's hard. And the risk you face with in countries like the UK when you start opening up after your lockdown is that you may have second waves and third waves of the virus coming again. Hopefully, we will be able to avoid that in Sweden. Hopefully, the level of immunity have reached such levels that we won't have those other waves coming in a way that I fear that you will have. Well, so that's the reason I think we need to try to combine this, well, raising herd immunity while at the same time protecting, well, the elderly and other groups that we really need to protect. That's a key challenge, I think.
Indeed. Well, let me bring in Otto Brons Petersen from Denmark now, because as I said, Denmark had quite a harsh lockdown, but was, I think, the first to start opening up. And I know that Otto has been to the hairdresser today, which is something the rest of us can only dream of. But Denmark has already opened up some weeks ago, day centers, small businesses, primary schools. Schools have, I think, smaller classes and distancing and hygiene, just as is proposed here. But Otto, tell us about your experience and what you've learned from this lockdown.
Good evening. I guess the best thing to be said about Denmark is that so far we have had very few people dying compared to other countries. I think that compared to Sweden, 3 times as many Swedes have died, correcting for the size of the population as they have in Denmark. Compared to Italy and the UK, the numbers are 5 times as high as in Denmark. So in that respect, we have been successful. However, this also reflects that we haven't had probably that many infected. So we are not as close to herd immunity as you are in Sweden, as Niels was just discussing. In Denmark, we closed down pretty early. We did it much harsher than in Sweden, but not as harsh as you ended up doing in the UK or in Italy. And a special thing for the Danish case is that the government really never had and still hasn't got a clear strategy. Or an overview of strategies they're trying to follow. So they're sort of playing it a lot by ear as they go along, and that has meant that we've seen a number of policy changes coming along. Some of them not very expected because we haven't had this clear plan for how to deal with the epidemic. We've seen very little openness. It's been very difficult for outside academics, for instance, to get an idea of the projections made by the government, what has been the basis for them. But it is true that since Easter, especially, we have been reopening gradually. This week, we are opening restaurants, cafes, shopping malls are opening. We still need to gatherings for more than 10 people are still not allowed. So they are still restricted, but we have started opening up, and according to the political discussions going on right now, there's going to be a further opening up in the beginning of June, where we will open up for gatherings of 30 to 50 people. We'll start opening museums, research facilities, and a lot more educational institutions that are closed right now. So we are opening up. We still have our borders are closed to anybody but Danes mostly, and people who get special permission. So I get to go easily to Sweden. It's open to everybody from the EU, but they have difficult time going to us. But we are opening up, and I think there are a number of reasons why this is happening now. One reason is that we have seen actually a lot of shutdown fatigue, and the Danish population really hasn't been prepared for a long shutdown. So that's showing now, and we are expecting very high economic costs from the shutdown. We'll see the greatest recession in my lifetime, I hope, this year. It's going to a huge cost on the Danish economy. At the same time, we have had huge overcapacity in our healthcare system. It hasn't been overwhelmed at all, and we've seen our transmission rate of the illness is falling has fallen much more than expected. But I think the main reason why we are reopening now is that the authorities have realized that the main reason for the fall in the transition rate and the development of the epidemic in Denmark really hasn't been the shutdown. The main reason why the illness or the epidemic is now falling is that because of voluntary social distancing. So you can even ask, and this is not clear, whether the shutdown has not helped the social distancing, but rather served as a substitute, so that when people they distance themselves voluntarily, they of course take into take into effect how risky it is, and if you shut something down, it becomes less risky not to have social distancing. So actually, it's not clear, and we're beginning to think about this, whether our shutdown policy really has had the opposite effect of what it was supposed to be. So that's the main reason we are now opening our economy up and beginning, I think, on a test and trace and isolate path, which is sort of the main new political priority.
So Otto, I mean, that sort of last point you said, you've been opening up now for 3 weeks. Are people respecting that? Because the argument here is that, well, the more you open, then people are going to gather in large groups, and they're going to go long distances to scenic spots and all the rest of it, and you'll never control it. So Danes are got more self-discipline than we have, or what?
Yes, the authorities have consistently been surprised by how low the transition rate is. When we before Easter, when we were starting to reopening, there was an expectation that our transition rate would go up from below 1 to above 1. And if it's above 1, you will have the epidemic will grow. But it has consistently been less than 1. And it's right now it is just 0.7, even if we have opened up quite a bit. So it seems that people are still keeping their social distancing, and it's working. But of course, you have to wonder. In the longer run, we will probably see that the transition rate will approach 1, because if it becomes very safe to go out, and it is quite safe now, you don't need that much social distancing. But I think we are learning that people are adjusting their behavior in a rational manner, and much more than the simple models predict.
Thanks very much, Otto. Let's move to Italy with Alberto Guardi. I don't know what to say, Alberto, because you really in Milan are right in the thick of it, or you certainly were in the thick of it in Europe. Although you, I think, have already begun easing yourselves with factories and construction back, and public transport running, and so on. So tell us about your experience.
Well, different regions in Italy have opened up on Monday this week. So in Milan, the situation changed. Beginning on May 4th, we started, for example, being able once again to go have a run in the morning. So our life is partially back to normal. Constructions are working. Public transports are working. Of course, in a whole bunch of different establishments, you do have rules that are different than what we were used to. So, for example, only takeaways in restaurants and bars, that sort of stuff. Milan, as you said, even has been very severely hit. The virus first outbreak in Italy were in Lombardy and in Veneto. The Italian healthcare system is regionally structured. So we saw very different responses in Veneto and in Lombardy. Veneto is the region near Venice. In Veneto, the outbreak was in a very small town near Padua, Vo Euganeo. The regional government was able to have a local lockdown and do aggressive tests and tracing right from the beginning. So the outbreak in Veneto has been, I would say, successfully contained. On the top of that, the experience in Vo Euganeo has been a very interesting case study, which is helping in generating knowledge about COVID-19 for researchers all over the world. In Lombardy, the initial outbreak was south of Milan. Unfortunately, there was a second outbreak near Bergamo, an old city, a very entrepreneurial, a very well connected in the world area. In this second outbreak, we didn't have any local lockdown. The death toll, which has been paid in Bergamo, has been very dramatic. I mean, basically, half of the deaths in Italy are located in Lombardy, and most of them are located near Bergamo, and they're very likely to be underestimated. The situation of the contagion in different regions is very different. In Lombardy, today, actually, the number of contagion went up quite a bit, but we've been explained that one of the biggest problems has been how to collect data in a country of 60 million people. And so from time to time, we have discrepancies and changes in the way in which data are collected. At the very same time, we do have regions with a very small number of currently infected people, like Sardinia, a very small number of people in intensive care units. In Sardinia today are 11 of them. In Umbria, a region that I know lots of British people love, you got 4 people in ICUs today. So really, the phase 2 in Italy ought to be regional and have different rules in different places. The best news insofar as flattening the curve is concerned is that we succeeded basically in doubling the number of ICUs in the country, particularly in Lombardy. That process was very effective. So we started this emergency with a little less than 900 beds. Then we went up to 1,700, and now occupancy is only 330. So that is actually what gives me hope that we may be capable in managing a second wave when it comes.
Alberto, you mentioned the regional differences, and this, as I said, is something which is of interest here because we have the different countries in the United Kingdom having different rules. How can you manage that? I mean, are people from one region prevented from going to another, or how can you lock down in one place and open up in another?
Well, Italians basically gave up their civil liberties, I suppose, as many people elsewhere too. So for a certain number of days, I mean, for most of the lockdown, people were locked down in their own municipalities. Now people are locked down in their own regions. This is a bit absurd because, you may be living on the border and actually be closer to a city in Veneto than you are to Milan. But still, that's the rule now. I think expectations are that this rule will be eased sometime soon. But I think people will be very careful, particularly people in the south. Now, the main reason, for the Italian lockdown is that, as I said before, the healthcare system is regional and very uneven. So Lombardy, which had plenty of problems in terms of public healthcare, so to say, insofar as the quality of hospital healthcare provision is considered one of the best regions in Europe. Some parts of the south of Italy clearly are not. So in a way, the national lockdown was first and foremost a policy to protect those regions where the quality of healthcare provision is typically low, because they will certainly not have been capable of coping with an emergency such as this. Then, of course, not being able to cross the border, part of it is just craziness. It's very difficult to endorse it. But at the very same time, if we look at mobility data as they're provided to us, we need to say that Italians have been tremendously obedient in these circumstances.
Well, that brings me on to a question which we've had from one of our viewers, which is that how far has the policy in each country been supported by the media and by the public? I mean, I think the answer in Britain is that the lockdown policy was supported more than even the government itself imagined. And people in the early days were saying, well, the government's actually put its foot in it here, because they said, well, we're locking down, but they didn't actually believe that anybody would do it. But in fact, we all did, being British. And I just wondered how far the policy has been accepted, or whether how critical people are. I mean, Niels, how critical are people of the?
I would say that I mean, the Swedish experience is very similar to the Danish one. That people have practiced social distancing only by having these recommendations coming from the public health authority, not really from the politicians, but from the bureaucracy, from the experts. So they've been saying that, you know, you should stay away from the elderly, you should keep 2 meters distance, you should wash your hands, you should do all these simple things. And to, I mean, Sweden is a high trust country, both horizontally, and we trust each other. We're very responsible, just like the Danes. And we also have this vertical trust that we trust authorities and politicians usually, sometimes too much. But in this case, I think it worked, you know. Of course, in media, there has been strong calls for you know, strict lockdowns, because of the somewhat higher death rates in the short term. But we will see about Denmark in the longer term. That's we don't know yet. We don't know we can't assess this perhaps for 3 or 4 years. It would take a long time to see the total cost of the different strategies. That's why I think we should be very humble when we make these statements, you know. So it hasn't really it has been discussions in media, it has been political discussions, but the consensus culture in politics is very strong. So in general, politicians have agreed. Some people in media, some experts, other scientists and so on, of course, have disagreed. Some of them influenced by these UK studies that made you change your own strategy, I think, you know.
And Otto, I mean, are people in Denmark looking wistfully across the water, across the bridge, and saying, well, we should be doing more of what Sweden's doing? And
well, an interesting fact is that in most countries, the government has been, political parties running the government has seen a lot of wave of support. This has also been the case in Denmark. The Prime Minister's Social Democratic Party is more popular, and it has been for a very, very long time. So there has been very strong support, and especially in the beginning, when there was a lot of fear that what happened in Italy, which we could see on the news, could happen here as well. So in the beginning, there was strong support. The opposition in parliament was very weak. The media were very uncritical about some of the, for instance, some of the new powers given to the government, which something we usually don't see, restricting civil liberties and so on. So, but that has changed somewhat. There has been, as I mentioned, a lockdown fatigue, and the government has also been quite closed about information. And some economists started to question what is really the strategy? How long is this going to last? What do you base your policies on? And the media caught on. So there has been a pressure on the government, and we're seeing people becoming more skeptical, and it's quite clear that we can keep a lockdown up for a long time. If there were to come a second wave of the pandemic or the epidemic in Denmark after the summer, I'm quite sure that we wouldn't see a harsh lockdown as the one we've seen, even if it was believed that it would do the trick.
Thank you very much, Otto. And please do send in your questions. They're coming in live, so we'd like a lot of questions to choose from. But one which has come in is quite interesting, which is that younger people have suffered more than most as a result of this lockdown. But at the same time, they're the least at risk from the virus. So they're being badly affected. There has been a suggestion in Britain that we should allow under 30s basically back to work. Certainly people around the age of 30, that they should be able to go back to work, because the chances of them suffering severely from the virus are small, and it would get them back in work and it would get the economy going again. So I wondered, but this has been rejected quite early on by the government as being, well, it would lead to resentment and there'd be cheating at the marginal age and so on. So I just wonder whether any of these ideas have been raised in other countries, such as Italy, for example, Alberto.
Yes, the idea of keeping the elderly more protected was initially considered by the government. The idea was, keeping everybody above 65 years old home, which of course is not that old. I mean, it used to be perhaps 2 generations ago, old age, but now it's no longer. I think that has been rejected for 2 reasons. First of all, that would have been extremely unpopular, particularly in an aging society, in an aged society like the Italian one, but also because it wasn't actually an idea supported by scientists, because scientists look at contagion, and clearly, becoming infections basically depends on your social contact and not upon your age. Your age affects, the likelihood of having a very severe form of COVID-19. But even in that case, I think it was a very high political risk to take for somebody to say, well, I'm going this direction. What is actually more interesting and perhaps quite telling about Italy is that the thing nobody is considering here is reopening schools and universities. So the idea now is that school will reopen in September. And even in September, they will have basically half of the class will be attending lectures in person, and half of the class will be connected and having lecture remotely, which is quite bizarre, actually. I think it would be very difficult to explain to young kids. But I think, that is really affecting severely, particularly the female population. And also these attitudes towards school is actually opening up, should be opening up at least, a discussion about new kinds of inequalities, because clearly, the lockdown is affecting people in a very different way, depending on their income, on the extent by which they are, lucky enough to live in a place with broadband, the size of their family and all that.
Anyone else like to come in on?
Sure. This was one of the reasons we didn't close down the schools in Sweden, of course. So child care center schools up until 9th grade has been open all the time. And then they closed down high schools. And I have a daughter who's in high school. And they do distance learning, and that's been quite criticized, actually. I think that was a big mistake. They should have kept the high schools open as well. For that very reason that you mentioned, that the risks for those groups are minuscule, and the cost for society to have the schools shut, it affects parents, it affects, all kinds of things in a society to close down the schools. And the cost for the children, imagine that, losing 3 months or something of schooling. That's a very high cost. So that was one of the reasons, actually. I think you should do that immediately, open up the schools in the UK.
We've had a couple of questions on the statistics. Firstly, how far has the presentation of the disease statistics, both nationally and globally, been a help or a hindrance in governments understanding what's going on and forming appropriate policies? And in particular, has the modeling been a help or a hindrance? For example, I mean, the Imperial College model suggested that there should be many more deaths in Sweden than there are now, and similarly in the United Kingdom. So, you know, we've put measures in place, but even so, the difference between what the model originally predicted and which generated the lockdown and what's actually happened is enormous. So are people suspicious of the statistics in your countries and the models?
May I take that one?
Yes.
Having a background in Austrian economics, I'm always skeptical to statistics and this kind of mathematical models. And it's been very clear, I think, in this pandemic that the statistics in different countries varies enormously, you know. How much is reported? Is it, I mean, China we don't trust at all, but there are huge differences even within the European Union, of course, and among OECD countries. Then it comes to these modeling, you know, social scientists trying to be some other kinds of scientists. And it's as always, it's useful to do these kind of things. You need to do it in order to make projections, to assess, well, if you're approaching herd immunity and stuff like that, for sure. But you should always, as in social science, you should be skeptical towards those very mathematized statistical models, for sure.
Alberto, you wanted to get in on this?
Yes, I mean, yesterday a very good article, alas in Italian, has been published by former chief epidemiologist of the Italian National Healthcare Institute. And he pointed out that according to the Ferguson model, so to say, Italy should have had 500,000 deaths in the case of no lockdown. But even with a strict lockdown, the model estimated 283,000 deaths. And of course, 30,000 people died, which is already, you know, a very, very high amount. So I think one of the problem here is that we're dealing with extremely sophisticated but yet difficult models that are very, not very easily communicated to people. And also they provide, and they may provide useful information in conceiving policies, but they cannot clearly take into account the fact that we're dealing to two different adaptive situations. On the one hand, the virus is a biological phenomenon, it's not a statistical one. And on the other hand, of course, we do have society, and society is adaptive too. So the way in which people are changing their behavior is going to be affecting the result. You know, that doesn't, as for reasons Niels has already alluded to, that doesn't really fit very well into modeling.
Otto, statistics in Denmark, do people believe them or not believe them? Or
I think that some of the most helpful statistics we have had is the most credible, and that's the statistics concerning how many people have died, how many people are in intensive care. Of course, there are differences across countries how you register somebody who is dying from an illness and is also infected by the COVID-19. Is it the COVID-19 or is it the illness? And there are differences there, but these numbers have been quite credible. Some numbers we really have missed and still do miss, and we should have had much earlier, and that is numbers from random testing of the entire population to see how many people have really been infected and how many have achieved immunity. And we don't know that much about it. That would be very, very interesting to know, and we've been pushing Danish economists have been pushing very hard to get this, testing, random testing up and running. When we're talking about the models, I think they have been, especially because they haven't been documented that much in Denmark. They haven't, and they have, the conclusions have changed quite a lot over a short time span, and that has meant that the models are not really that trusted. And I think there is a realization now that many of these models, simple models for epidemics, are really too simple to take into account that people change their behavior. And if they change their behavior, the result is much different from a model where you're studying animals or plants or anything like that. So that'll give you very different results. I think that's what we're realizing now.
Well, here's another question which has come through, that the COVID-19 has frightened everybody. So how far were the lockdowns done to manage the politics rather than the facts? And when it comes to reopening, is it going to be facts that drive the reopening strategies in our different countries, or is it going to be more like politics? So anyone like to have a shot at that one?
Complex question, I would say. It's all about politics, of course. I mean, we're talking about what kind of strategies or policies that need to be implemented here to handle this new phenomenon that this pandemic really is. You know, it's a new thing, and I think Alberto made a very important point there, that these kind of projections and models and statistical analysis that we see can't really be trusted, because we adapt all the time. We change our behavior, we learn, and I think societies learn as well. You know, so facts in a sense are always old. It's something that you look behind you, but we need to look forward now. You know, that's a challenge. We need to construct strategies that open up, that are forward-looking, and that's a lot harder. It takes judgment and a balanced way of looking at things. And I don't think anyone really has the answer to what to do. So we have to try different strategies. We have to change them when they don't work, and then we have to develop better strategies. That's life.
We've had a couple of questions on the economic effects of lockdown. Firstly, given that the economic pain is really being concentrated on the private sector, private organizations and voluntary organizations, whereas the public sector is largely unaffected and people are still being paid. So is that a problem? And secondly, of course, how are we going to pay for all of this? Is it going to be higher taxes at the end of it, or is it going to be more borrowing, or the cheat way of doing it, which is to have inflation? Or is it going to be economic growth? So maybe on the tax and economic things, maybe Otto, you might have some ideas on that.
Yeah. Actually, we might be a little bit the odd man out here, because we have, after decades of reforms, we have actually achieved over-sustainable public finances, meaning that we are, in the long run, collecting more taxes than we plan to spend. So, actually, the public finances in Denmark is in rather good shape. We're going to see a huge deficit this year, but if we can contain the recession to a short supply side recession, it's not going to put a major strain on the Danish public finances. So we're probably not going to see tax increases finances. But this might be very different in other countries, and I'm especially worried about your country, Alberto. What's going to happen there?
Well, that's a good question, Alberto. And also, I mean, other people have asked this as well. What about relations within the European Union? Because Italy needs some money, and I'm not sure that Germany is going to come up with it.
Well, what's happening in Italy, when you look at projection, is clearly a tremendous raise in public debt. So the thing that you need to remember when it comes to this crisis is that Italy was a very frail patient at the beginning of the year. So growth estimates were basically 0.2%. Debt to GDP ratio was already 135%. So now for the newer estimate, we're going to be seeing something like minus 10% in GDP, and a public debt that would be between 155 and 160% at the end of it. I think the European Union has been so far extremely generous with the country's demand. It allowed everybody to access ESM borrowing conditions without any conditionality, really, just depending upon spending this money to cope with the crisis. There is this new program which is called SURE for unemployment. And of course, I mean, the ECB has been really doing whatever it could insofar as buying is concerned. The problem is, and I think that's a great weakness, it's of course the public choice of having a tremendous amount of money to spend, because it's rarely seen that such a great pot of money is given to business just to survive, so to say, for example, based upon their record in the 3 years before the crisis. What's going to be happening is clearly lots of discretionary spending, beginning with the bailout of Alitalia, really the kind of company any government in the world would love to possess, particularly in a crisis like this, which is severely affecting air travel, if our prime minister hasn't noticed that. And, a whole bunch of discretionary measures. So Italy is going to be going through a tremendous wave of new interventionism. We're talking about government buying equity in medium-sized companies. We already seen, a stronger version of golden power, which is the Italian version of the British golden share. So it is not that all of this money is spent in order to have some overcapacity in the healthcare system and therefore be able to go back to life. Clearly, we do have a government with a clear-cut ideology, and they're seizing a wonderful opportunity for a power grab.
May I add a little bit on this concerning Otto's comment in particular, I think. I mean, Sweden is in a similar situation. The problem is that, Sweden, as Denmark, we are export-oriented, open, small economies. And if the rest of the world stays closed through lockdowns, there will be no demand. Italy will have no tourists coming, and we won't go to Copenhagen to drink beer, the costs are going to be enormous, also for the public. Public revenue is going to fall. Taxes are going to rise. You will see all kinds of stupid policy about nationalizing companies. In Sweden, people who are getting subsidies not to fire people, this short-term Kurzarbeit, that is say Germany, short-term things, they can't hand out dividends to the stockholders anymore, it's shareholders. It's really all kinds of interventionist, statist, socialist policies that are being implemented everywhere. And business are, becoming more pro-business and less pro-market. So that's the real challenge. And that's the challenge of the European Union. we should open up the single market. We should open up for digital services. We should open up traveling, everything, you know. Otherwise, it will become disastrous, I think, in a while here.
All right, we've had lots of
Problematic.
questions, but one last question, since the hour is drawing to a close, has come through, and it's: do you believe that the media has behaved responsibly, or has it fanned the fear of the pandemic for their own purposes, particularly their own political biases? And certainly in the UK, this is a concern to many of us, that we've had a traditionally aggressive way of dealing with politicians, and now we're in a crisis situation, and the politicians, you can see, are trying to do their best, but they're still being subjected to what we call gotcha questions, trying to wrong foot them. And I think many people in the public just feel that that's inappropriate at the moment. We actually want answers. We don't want to try to wrong foot politicians and embarrass them and all the rest of it. So do you think that the media in your own countries have been fair and balanced and reasonable, and or have they simply bigged up the human tragedies in order to make a big story, but that may have bad effects on policy? Niels, you've written on statecraft, so you may know something about this.
Well, a key thing in statecraft is to have what I call the central zone in a country. It has to be, they have to agree about things, you know. And I think the central zone, kind of extended elite, including the press, have to have the same beliefs about the world, more or less, for a country to develop in a good way. They don't have to agree about all values and everything, but how the world works. And I would say we've had a very sensible public discussion about this. There have been critique, people have questioned policies. There have been very, you know, the tendencies are very statist in a sense, you know, more subsidies, more rescue programs. But in general, I find it quite sensible. Also the press.
Otto, if you're
an important difference between countries.
Yeah. Otto, the media been sensible in Denmark?
Actually, yes. It's rather odd not having to complain about the media, as we often have reasons to do. But they have basically, I think, behaved quite responsibly, and they were slow to get a grip on this crisis, but they have actually been driving politics by asking a lot of questions and focusing on in a proper way on human tragedies, which was tended to be overlooked in the beginning, for instance, and but also on the scientific basis for policies. So I think on the whole that the media has worked very well. One type of media which I think has been very interesting to follow has been social media, in the sense that they have sort of covered the entire spectrum, from the people who were frightened, who were taking extreme positions to a degree that probably haven't seen before on the one hand, and on the other hand, I witnessed this enormous growth of scientific literature coming forward as the crisis progressed. I mean, it's been quite impressive to follow how many good papers, not just in Denmark, but around the world, the US, some of your countries have been produced very, very quickly, and we have become extremely up to date on the developments because of social media and the internet. And I think that has been a huge bonus. And the policies would have been much, much worse, at least in my country, if that hasn't been the case.
Alberto, you have a very lively media in Italy.
You know, I think it's rather difficult to answer this question. Media have been very uneven, clearly, in the quality of their reporting and comments. Certainly, I mean, as usually they are, I mean, newspapers have been more reflective, so to say. TV and social media have been playing more, I mean, with emotions. I would say the biggest concern is that out of the blue, television has started to be about a contest of different scientists instead of the typical contest of, you know, movie stars or soccer player or whatever. And I really fear at a certain point this would backlash, because clearly scientific contents are very difficult to communicate. They are counterintuitive to most people. And it's very difficult for people to go on TV and answer questions by saying, I really don't know about that, or we shall wait and see, because clearly it's the public that demands certainty. Even at stages in which we knew very little about the virus, and let's face it, I mean, we still know very little about it.
Yes, I look forward to a TV show on something like Statisticians in the Jungle. That's going to be a very interesting conversation. Friends, we're beyond our time now, so I have to draw it to a close. It's a pity because we have lots of questions. So thank you very much for everybody who's sent in questions. And thanks particularly to our panel, Alberto, Nils, and Otto, for making time here for this important subject. And we have another ASI webinar next Tuesday. So we'll see you then. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.